Get off my land. Those 3 words came out of Wallace Weston's mouth like gravel scraping across dry hardpan, and they hit Maude Prescott square in the chest before she had even fully climbed down from the buckboard seat. She stood there in the blazing August heat of 1882, one hand gripping the wagon wheel, her traveling dress already plastered to her back with sweat, and she stared at the man who was supposed to be her salvation, and found instead a wall of stone and fury. Mr. Weston. Her voice did not shake. She had promised herself it would not shake. I received your letter. I rode 3 days from Abilene. I am not going anywhere until you hear what I have to say. I did not write any letter. His jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle jumping under his cheekbone. He was tall, lean in the way that men who work from sunup to sundown become lean, and his eyes were the color of the dust that had claimed everything within 100 miles. Whoever sent you here was playing a cruel game, and I suggest you turn that wagon around before this day gets worse than it already is. The irony nearly broke her composure. She had left behind a secret that could get her killed. She had crossed territories where the heat rose off the earth in visible waves. She had buried her last coin buying oats for the horse because she needed the horse to survive the journey. And now a man who had not even written to her was telling her to leave, because apparently someone had used his name to lure her to the most desolate stretch of ranch land she had ever seen. Someone used your name, she said carefully. Someone wanted me here. You should want to know why just as badly as I do, Mr. Weston, because it means someone is playing with both of us. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression, just barely, the way a crack moves through dry earth when the pressure below it becomes too great to ignore. Step down, he said at last. I will hear you out, but you are not staying. He would eat those words. He just did not know it yet. 6 weeks earlier, Maude Prescott had been working as a bookkeeper for a man named Clarence Dodd in Abilene, Kansas, and she had discovered something in those ledgers that she was absolutely not supposed to discover. Clarence Dodd was not simply a cattle broker. He was skimming money from a land trust that funded the water rights of half the county, and the men behind that trust were not the kind of men who accepted auditors finding their secrets and walking away clean. Maude had been careful with numbers her whole life. Her father, a schoolteacher in Missouri, had raised her on arithmetic and logic, and the belief that truth was always worth more than comfort. He had died of fever when she was 20, leaving her with a sharp mind, a modest trunk of belongings, and no living family to fall back on. She had made her way to Abilene on the promise of work, and for 2 years she had been reliable and quiet and invisible, the way a woman alone in a hard world learns to be. But invisible did not protect her when she found the false entries. It did not protect her when Dodd's associate, a thick-necked man named Harlan Creel, walked in on her with the evidence spread across her desk at midnight. It did not protect her when Creel told her, in a voice so calm it was more frightening than shouting, that she had 24 hours to forget everything she had seen, or the consequences would fall not just on her, but on the widow woman who let her a room on Pecan Street. Maude had not forgotten. But she had run, and running meant leaving Abilene with almost nothing, and the only lead she had was an advertisement she had torn from the town notice board 3 months earlier, because something about it had caught her imagination, and she had tucked it into her Bible the way you tuck a thing you might need someday. The advertisement had read, "Rancher in Cedar Creek County, Texas seeks woman of honest character, capable of hard work and willing to build something lasting in difficult country. Inquire for Wallace Weston, Weston Ranch, near the town of Harlan Flats." She had written to Wallace Weston the same night she ran. She had written honestly, which perhaps was the wrong instinct given the circumstances, but Maude Prescott did not know how to be dishonest, and she had explained that she was a skilled bookkeeper, that she was in urgent need of a fresh start, and that she was willing to work for room and board while she assessed whether a more permanent arrangement might suit them both. She had not waited for a reply. She had purchased passage on the first southbound stage out of Abilene, and when a letter reached her care of a boarding house in Wichita Falls, bearing the name W. Weston and promising welcome and work, she had taken it as providence and continued south. Only standing in front of the real Wallace Weston, with his granite jaw and his furious eyes and his complete denial of any such letter, did she understand that someone had intercepted her correspondence and written back on his behalf, using his name to point her straight toward a man who did not want her, and a ranch that looked like it was dying by degrees in the worst heat she had ever witnessed. The land around Weston Ranch was extraordinary in its ruin. She had noticed it coming in, the way the grass had gone to pale straw as far as she could see, the way the creek bed that ran along the eastern edge of his property was nothing but a scar of cracked mud, the way even the cottonwood trees that lined the drive looked like they had forgotten what water tasted like. She had passed 3 other ranch properties on the road in from Harlan Flats, and every one of them had worn the same exhausted look: fences falling, cattle thin, the particular quiet that comes when living things have nothing left to fight with. She sat across from Wallace Weston at his kitchen table, which was rough pine and solid as a promise, and she laid the letter out between them. He read it twice. She watched his face and saw the recognition she expected, not recognition of his own handwriting, but recognition of a handwriting that was familiar to him from somewhere else. "Where did you say this reached you?" he asked. "Wichita Falls. A boarding house on the main road run by a Mrs. Hendricks. She is a respectable woman. She gave it to me without opening it, I can assure you. I know where Wichita Falls is." He set the letter down with the particular care of a man placing a thing that might explode. "I did not write this. But I know who did." The silence stretched out between them. Outside, the heat pressed against the windows like something alive. A horse somewhere in the near corral shifted and stamped and went still again. "His name is Dodd," she said quietly, and watched every muscle in his face tight. "Clarence Dodd. Yes." She kept her hands flat on the table, her voice steady. "I worked for him. I found something I was not supposed to find. I ran. And someone used your name to bring me here, which means either Dodd knew your name and connected it to me somehow, or someone else wants me in Cedar Creek County for a reason I have not worked out yet." Wallace Weston stood up so abruptly his chair scraped back across the floor, and the sound of it was like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, one hand braced on the frame, and he looked out over the dying land that he had been fighting for and losing to for 6 straight years. "Dodd and I have history," he said, and his voice had changed, gone lower, stripped of the defensive edge. "He has been trying to acquire this land for 3 years. Not because he wants to run cattle on it. Because the water rights attached to this property run along a tributary of the Brazos, and whoever holds those rights holds leverage over every ranch in this county and several in the next." Maude felt the cold clarity of it settle over her despite the heat. "The trust," she said. "The land and water trust. He is falsifying the records to make it look like ranchers have defaulted on their agreements so he can seize the rights legally." He turned to look at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, the anger in his face gave way to something else entirely. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was the specific expression of a man who has been fighting in the dark and suddenly finds another person standing in the same room, also fighting, also tired. "You saw the ledgers," he said. "I copied the relevant pages before I ran," she said, and reached inside her jacket and laid a folded sheaf of papers on the table beside the forged letter. "I am a bookkeeper, Mr. Weston. I know what evidence looks like." He stared at the papers for a long moment. Then he sat back down across from her, and for the first time she noticed the exhaustion in him, not just the anger, but the deep, bone-level tiredness of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. "My name is Wallace," he said. "Maude," she replied. It was not a beginning and it was not a declaration, but it was a door cracked open, and even in all that dust and heat and danger, something in her chest recognized the significance of that small word. She stayed, of course. There was nowhere else to go, and the threat from Dodd and Creel was real enough that returning to any city where they had reached would be the same as stepping into the trap herself. Wallace gave her the small bedroom off the kitchen, the one with the single window that looked east toward the empty creek, and he did it without ceremony, setting a clean towel and a candle on the washstand, and telling her supper was at sundown without quite meeting her eyes. The town of Harlan Flats was 4 miles to the west, and it had the look of every frontier town Maude had passed through in her travels, one main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon that doubled as a gambling hall, a livery, a church that held services twice a month when the circuit preacher came through, and a post office that also served as the county recorder's office, and therefore the repository of the very land and water trust documents that Clarence Dodd had been corrupting for years. Wallace told her all of this on her second day, sitting on the porch in the thin hour before the sun became murderous, each of them with a tin cup of coffee going cool in the heat. He told her about the drought, which had started in the summer of 1879 and had deepened every year since, how Palo Duro Creek, which should have run clear and strong through June at least, had dropped to a trickle in April and dried entirely by May, how his cattle were surviving on water hauled from a deep well that had been sinking lower by the month. He told her about his neighbor Elias Whitmore, whose family had ranched the adjacent property for 20 years and who had nearly sold out to Dodd's land agent twice before stubbornness, and the memory of his wife's grave on the East Hill kept him from doing it. He told her about old Inez Vasquez, who ran a small sheep operation south of town and whose family had been in this valley since before the Republic of Texas, and who had more knowledge of the land and its moods than anyone else in the county. He did not tell her very much about himself. Not yet. Maude watched because watching was what she knew how to do. She watched how he moved through the day, deliberate and unhurried in a way that she understood came not from laziness, but from years of learning that panic used up more water than a man could afford to lose in that climate. She watched how he spoke to his 2 ranch hands, a wiry older man named Carl Dupree, and a young Mexican man named Roberto who could not have been more than 20 and who worked with a quiet ferocity that commanded respect. She watched how Wallace checked the well level every morning and evening, lowering a rope with a knot every 2 feet, counting knots the way another man might count prayers. She set herself to work on the 3rd morning without asking permission, which she suspected was either the right instinct or the wrong one, and found quickly it was the right one. She took stock of his household accounts, which were maintained on the backs of seed invoices, and in a notebook that had been used for 2 different purposes and was consequently legible only to someone willing to sort it through carefully. She found that he was behind on 3 supply accounts in town, but current on his bank note, which was either excellent management or the result of brutal sacrifices in other areas, and she suspected the latter when she noticed that the pantry was running thin. She reorganized everything into a proper ledger she found in the bottom of a trunk in the parlor, unused, still wrapped in the paper it had been sold in, and when Wallace came in at noon and found her bent over the kitchen table with ink on her fingers and 6 neat columns growing across the page, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her in a way she felt along her spine. "I did not ask you to do that," he said. "I know," she said, without looking up. "You are going to run out of coffee by the end of August. You are already out of proper lamp oil and have been burning tallow, which is why the kitchen smells the way it does. Your cattle account owes Elkins Mercantile $11, but Elkins owes you $17 from last spring's beef delivery and has apparently forgotten this. I have drafted a letter of accounting if you want it." She finished the entry she was writing and looked up at him. He was still standing in the doorway. The look on his face was something she could not quite name, and it unsettled her in a way that felt completely different from the unsettling that Harlan Creel had made her feel, which had been cold and threatening. This was warmer. This was complicated. "You have good numbers," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I am not going to apologize for how I spoke to you when you arrived." She had not expected an apology, and she said so. "But I am glad you stayed," he added, and she could hear what it cost him to say it, the way certain honest things cost a proud person more than money. He turned and went back outside before she could respond, and she sat there for a moment with her pen in her hand and her heart doing something strange and irregular in her chest, and then she went back to her columns. On her 5th day at the ranch, she met Elias Whitmore. He came riding in on a bay horse that had seen better years, an old man with a white beard and eyes the color of faded denim, and he pulled up in the yard and looked at Maude standing on the porch with a surprised delight that was instantly endearing. "Well," he said to Wallace, who had come out of the barn, "you did not tell me you had company." "She is not company," Wallace said, in a tone that managed to be both factually accurate and somehow the most defensively unhelpful description of a person that Maude had ever heard. "Maude Prescott," she said, coming down the porch steps and offering her hand, which Whitmore shook with the gentleness of a man who had raised daughters. "Elias Whitmore," he said, "neighbor from the east side. You are the bookkeeper, then?" She raised an eyebrow toward Wallace, who was studiously looking at the barn. Apparently he had mentioned her to at least one person. "I am," she said. "Good," Whitmore said, swinging down from his horse, "because I need someone with good numbers to look at the documents I pulled from the recorder's office last week before Dodd's man gets wind that I have them." Things moved faster after that. Whitmore had the instincts of a man who had seen enough of the world to know when something wrong was being done to him, and he had spent the better part of a month quietly gathering copies of the trust records, visiting the county recorder on the pretext of confirming his property boundaries, and taking careful handwritten notes on the documents he was allowed to examine in the office. He had not known what to do with those notes until Wallace mentioned Maude. She spent 2 evenings at Whitmore's kitchen table, his daughter Cora serving coffee and cornbread and listening with wide, serious eyes, and she compared Whitmore's notes against her own copied pages from Dodd's ledgers, and what she found confirmed everything she had feared and then some. Dodd had not just been skimming. He had been systematically falsifying the trust records to show water rights defaults for every property in the valley, with the intention of filing a consolidated claim with the State Land Office in Austin that would give him control of all primary water access in the county. Once that claim was registered, every rancher in Cedar Creek County would either pay Dodd for the water their animals needed to survive or watch their herds die and their land become worthless. The drought was not Dodd's doing. The drought was simply his timing. He had waited for the dry years to make people desperate enough that they might not scrutinize the paperwork too carefully. "We need to get this to the county judge," Whitmore said. "Judge Alderman is in Dodd's pocket," Wallace said from his end of the table, and the flatness in his voice said this was not suspicion but knowledge. "Then Austin," Maude said. They both looked at her. "The State Land Office," she said. "If we file a counter-complaint before Dodd's claim is registered, with proper documentation showing the records have been falsified, a state investigator has to come out. The local judge cannot block a state inquiry. That takes someone willing to make the ride to Austin," Whitmore said. "It takes money for the filing," Wallace said. "How much?" Maude asked. The number was not large, but it was more than anyone at the table had readily available, which she expected. She did the arithmetic in her head, considered what she knew of Wallace's accounts, added what Whitmore had mentioned in passing about his own situation, and arrived at a conclusion she did not love but could live with. "I have a watch," she said, "silver engraved. It was my father's. It will get $40 at the jeweler in Harlan Flats. Together with what you can both put in, that should cover the filing and the stage fare to Austin." "No," Wallace said immediately. "Wallace." "No." He stood up and walked to the window, and she could see the argument working through him, the pride of a man who could not stand the thought of a woman selling her dead father's watch on his account. "It is not right." "It is practical," she said, and kept her voice gentle because she could hear how much it cost him to be the kind of man who needed helping. My father was a schoolteacher who believed in doing what was necessary. He would understand. The silence in the room was the kind that decides things. I will ride to Austin, Wallace said at last, turning from the window. Day after tomorrow. I will prepare all the documents tonight, Maude said. I will ride with you to the county line, Whitmore said, case anyone tries to intercept. Cora Whitmore, who had not spoken all evening, said quietly, I will pray for rain. Nobody laughed, because in the 6th week of the worst August that anyone in Cedar Creek County could remember, prayer for rain was not a joke. It was the only currency that still held any value. The night before Wallace left for Austin, Maude could not sleep. She lay in the narrow bedroom with the window open, letting what little night air there was move over her, and she listened to the ranch settle into its nocturnal sounds, the horses in the corral shifting, an owl working somewhere out in the dead grass, the distant sound of coyotes traveling east. She had been here less than 2 weeks, and already the shape of this place had pressed itself into her. She knew which board on the porch creaked and how to step over it. She knew that Wallace's coffee was always too strong because he measured by judgment rather than measure, and his judgment ran toward strength. She knew that Roberto sang quietly to himself while he worked, old songs in Spanish that floated across the yard in the mornings, and seemed to the only music the heat allowed. She knew that Wallace Weston had been married once, and that his wife Clara had died 4 years ago of a fever, and that the grief of it sat in him the way a stone sits in a riverbed, smoothed by time but still there, still defining the flow of everything that moved around it. She knew this not because he had told her, but because of the way Cora Whitmore had squeezed her hand when she mentioned Clara's name in passing, the particular squeeze that women give each other to convey things that are too complicated and too tender to explain. She heard his footsteps on the porch long before he said anything. She heard him settle into the porch chair, the one that was slightly uneven, and she heard the small sound of a match being struck, and then the smell of pipe tobacco drifted through her window. She almost said nothing. She lay there in the dark and told herself to leave him to his solitary vigil, that she was not entitled to his thoughts the night before he risked himself for the sake of an argument she had brought to his door. But she got up and put on her robe and went out to the porch, and she sat in the other chair without asking, the way she had taken up the ledger without asking, operating on the instinct that, with this man, the right way in was always through the direct door. He looked at her sideways, and in the moonlight his face was younger than it looked in the sun, the harsh lines softened by the darkness, and she noticed for the first time that there was something in his eyes that was not just tiredness or grief. There was something that had been wakened up and was not entirely sure how to behave. I have been thinking, she said, about why Dodd used your name to bring me here. Tell me your theory, he said, exhaling smoke slowly into the still air. He knew I had the ledger copies. He knew I would run. He needed to know where I had gone so he could track the documents. If he sent me to you with a forged letter using your name, he had 2 results available to him. Either I handed you the documents, in which case he knew where they were and could come after both of us, or you rejected me, I moved on, he followed me to the next place. But you did not move on. I did not, she agreed, because of the connection to the trust. Partly, she said, and let the word carry whatever weight it chose to. He smoked in silence for a moment. The night stretched out around them, enormous and quiet and alive with the small sounds of things surviving in the heat. Clara would have liked you, he said. It was not what she expected him to say, and the generosity of it struck her somewhere undefended. She liked women who did not waste time apologizing for being capable. Maude was quiet for a moment, holding that gift carefully. Tell me about her, she said. He told her. He told her about a woman who had come west from Ohio with her schoolteacher parents, and who had learned to love the open sky before she ever learned to fear the weather, who had made a garden in the impossible soil and gotten tomatoes to grow through sheer determination and copious manure, who had laughed easily and argued seriously and been, in Wallace's careful, private words, the better half of every decision he had made in the 10 years they had together. She died in October of '78, he said. Fever took her in 3 days. The doctor from town was away, and by the time he came back it was over. She was 32 years old. The grief was not raw, but it was real, and Maude sat with it the way you sit with something real, not trying to soften it or move it along. "I am 30 years old," she said. "I have been alone for 7 years. Not as a choice, exactly. More as a consequence of never staying in one place long enough to give anyone the chance to know me, and being too busy being practical to notice that I was becoming lonely." He turned to look at her fully then, the pipe forgotten in his hand. In the moonlight his eyes were unreadable, but his attention was absolute. "You are not lonely here," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said, "I am not." They sat on the porch until past midnight, until the moon had moved a full quarter of its arc across the sky, and the coyotes had gone quiet, and the only sound was the thin wind beginning to stir from the north, which was unusual for August in Texas and worth noticing. Wallace left for Austin before dawn, with the documents wrapped in oilcloth inside his saddlebag and Whitmore riding beside him until the cedar breaks to the east. Maude watched him go from the porch and felt the peculiar vulnerability of caring about someone's safe return after years of only ever worrying about her own. She was not idle while he was gone. She never was. She organized the rest of the household accounts, prepared a full inventory of the ranch's assets and liabilities, and spent a long afternoon with old Inez Vasquez, who came calling on the second day of Wallace's absence with a jar of preserved peppers and a look in her dark eyes that said she had not come to bring food. Inez was 70 if she was a day, weathered and sturdy and sharp as the edge of a good knife, and she sat at Maude's kitchen table and told her things about the land and the water and the history of Cedar Creek County that no document in the county recorder's office would ever tell her. She told her about the spring that had fed Palo Duro Creek before the settlers arrived, a limestone spring up in the hills north of the Weston property that had been diverted 30 years ago to serve an irrigation project that had since failed and been abandoned. She told her that the old creek channel was still there, choked with debris and deliberately obstructed where it crossed onto the low land, and that if those obstructions were cleared, the spring water would find its old way to the creek bed again. "The drought is real," Inez said, in her precise and careful English, "but it is not as total as Dodd has made people believe. The creek is dry because the water is being stopped. Not by God, by men who put stones and timber in the channel and let the brush grow over it so no one would notice." Maude sat very still. "How long have you known this?" "Since the spring ran low the first year," Inez said. "But I am an old woman with sheep, and in this county that means my voice does not carry far. I have told Whitmore. He believed me but did not know what to do about it. I am telling you because you have the kind of mind that knows what to do with a true thing." "I need to see it," Maude said. "I know," Inez said. "That is why I brought the peppers. I thought the ride might be long and you should have something to eat." The next morning, Maude rode with Inez into the low hills north of the ranch, following a dry draw through cedar and live oak until they came to a place where a once strong spring seeped out of the limestone in a thin, persistent thread, too small to sustain what it once had, but there. And below it, the old channel, just as Inez had described, blocked with timber that had been placed deliberately and weathered enough to look natural if you were not looking for interference. Carl Dupree had ridden out with them at Maude's request, and when she showed him the obstruction and explained what Inez had told her, he pushed back his hat and blew out a slow breath. "That is maybe 4 days of work," he said. "Clearing the timber, clearing the brush, making sure the channel is sound. If Roberto helps and we work steady." "Then we start today," Maude said. She worked alongside them. There was no reason not to. Her traveling dress had already been consigned to the bottom of the trunk in favor of a practical skirt and a shirt she had found in the ranch's supply chest, and she was strong and did not pretend otherwise. She hauled branches and moved stones and worked until her shoulders ached and her hands blistered. And when Roberto looked at her with undisguised surprise on the first day, she caught his eye and said nothing. And by the second day, he had stopped being surprised and just handed her the next piece of timber. It was hard, honest work, and it was the best she had felt in years. Wallace arrived back from Austin on the fourth day. He came riding in at dusk and found the ranch empty and quiet, the supper fire low but tended, a pot on the hook and no Maude. He found a note on the kitchen table in her clean, precise hand. Gone to the north draw. The creek may rise by morning. Do not worry but come when you are able. He came, of course. He came fast, the way a man comes when he has been 5 days on the road thinking about a woman, and arrives home to find her absent. He found them in the last hour of light, 3 people deep in mud and creek silt, Maude directing Carl and Roberto in moving the final section of timber from the channel, and the thin trickle of spring water already feeling its way down the cleared bed. He stood on the bank above them and looked down at the work they had done and at her, flushed and dirty and radiant with the particular satisfaction of having done something real and necessary, and something in his face went completely unguarded in a way she had never seen on him before. She looked up and found him there. "It will take a few days," she said. "The flow is small right now, but Inez believes the spring has more pressure than this. Once the channel is clear all the way down, she thinks it will strengthen. The filing is done," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "The State Land Office accepted the documentation. An investigator is coming to the county within 3 weeks." She climbed up the bank, and when she reached the top she was close enough to him that she could see the road dust still on his jaw and the relief in his eyes and the other thing that lived behind the relief, the thing that she had been watching develop for 2 weeks and that she recognized because she felt it in herself. "You look tired," she said. "I have been riding for 5 days thinking about whether you would still be here when I got back," he said, and the honesty of it was so straightforward and so unprotected that it was more intimate than any careful declaration. "I am still here," she said. "Yes," he said, "you are." They stood there on the bank of the nearly dry creek, while the last light faded out of the sky and the first stars arrived, and neither of them moved for a long moment, and the water below them moved in its new channel in the quiet, persistent way that water moves when it has found its way home. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, which was muddy, and she was aware of being muddy and did not care at all, and he looked at her with those dust-colored eyes that were not the color of dust anymore in this light, but the color of the sky right after sunset, when blue goes deep and turns into something that does not have a name. "Thank you," he said, "for the creek. For Austin, for all of it." "Wallace," she said. "Maude." And somehow those 2 words, just their names, just the sound of each other's names in the other's voice, were enough for the moment. They walked back to the ranch together in the warm dark, and when they passed through the kitchen door, she set about finishing supper, and he washed the road off his face at the pump. And Roberto and Carl ate with them at the big table, and Whitmore arrived halfway through supper, because he had seen the light in the north draw from his property, and needed to know what it meant, and the whole evening was noisy and warm and full of voices. And Maude sat in the middle of it and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as belonging, and it was the most dangerous and most wonderful thing she had felt in her adult life. The creek rose. Not overnight, and not dramatically at first, but Maude woke before dawn on the 5th day after clearing the channel and heard a sound she did not immediately recognize, a small, constant murmur from the direction of the creek bed, and she went to her window and stood in the pre-dawn gray and listened to it and knew. She pulled on her boots and walked out across the yard and through the gate and down the path to the creek, and in the thin early light she could see water moving in the bed, not deep, not yet, but moving, clear and cold from the limestone spring, running over the cracked mud and beginning the work of bringing it back. She was standing there, her boots at the edge, when Wallace came up behind her. She did not hear him approach, but she was not surprised either, as if some part of her had known he would come. "Well," he said very quietly. "It's rising," she said. "Yes." He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool morning. "It is." The water moved over the dry stones, and the sound of it was the most beautiful thing either of them had heard in a long time, and they stood together and listened to it for a while, and neither of them spoke, because the moment did not require words. By the time the sun was fully up and Carl had seen it and gone whooping across the yard, and Roberto had come running from the bunkhouse and dropped to one knee at the bank and put his hand in the water like a man receiving a blessing, Wallace turned to Maude and said, in a voice that had nothing performative in it, no audience, no pretense, "They are going to say you brought this." She laughed. "I did not bring the spring." "You found it," he said. "You and Inez, you found what was hidden and you fixed it. That counts as bringing something." "It was already there," she said. "So were you," he said, and the simplicity of it landed in her like a stone dropping into still water, spreading out in every direction. She looked up at him, and he was looking at her with an expression that held every conversation they had had in 2 weeks, every evening on the porch and every shared meal and every hour of parallel work, and every honest thing they had said and every honest thing they had been too careful to say yet. "I should tell you something," she said. "You should tell me a good many things," he agreed. "I am not going back to Abilene," she said. "I have nothing there. Whatever happens with Dodd and the investigation, whatever the state man finds, Abilene is not a place I can return to safely. But I also want to be clear that staying here is not something I expect you to feel obligated about. I can find work in Harlan Flats or I can continue west. I do not need to be a complication for you." He was quiet for a long moment and the water ran on below them. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "Ask it." "I would like to ask if you are staying because you have no other choice or because you want to stay here. And by here I do not mean the ranch. I mean here, with me." The vulnerability of it was extraordinary, coming from a man who was made of flint and deliberateness, and she recognized it because it mirrored her own vulnerability precisely, and she was not going to be less brave than he was. "I want to stay here," she said. "With you," he exhaled slowly. "Then stay," he said, "and we will work out the rest as we go." It was not, by conventional measure, a declaration of love. But it was a declaration of something more sustainable than love's first arrival, something like an agreement between two people who have both been through enough to know that choosing each other is the serious work, and the rest is the reward for that work. Dodd's man, Harlan Creel, arrived in Harlan Flats 10 days after Wallace's return from Austin, and everyone in town knew within an hour because Creel was not a subtle man. He took a room at the saloon, and he asked questions in the way that men like him ask questions, with his hands visible and his meaning less so, and the answers he got pointed him, inevitably, toward the Weston ranch. He came on a Wednesday morning, riding a black horse, and accompanied by another man whose name nobody knew, and he pulled up in the yard with the deliberate slowness of someone making a demonstration of not being afraid. Maude saw him from the kitchen window and recognized him immediately, and every muscle in her body went tight with the old fear. She made herself breathe. She made herself put down the bowl she was holding. She made herself think. Wallace came in from the barn when he heard the riders, and she caught him in the doorway before he went out. "The large man on the left," she said, her voice low. "That is Harlan Creel. He works for Dodd. He knows I have the ledger copies." Wallace's face was absolutely still. "Go to the back of the house," he said. "No," she said. "Maude, I am not hiding," she said. "Hiding is how this gets worse. I go out there with you and I have something to say, and that is the right play." He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, and she held his gaze without flinching, and he nodded just once and they went out together. Creel looked at her with those flat, cold eyes, and his expression did not change much, but something behind it shifted in the way a predator shifts when it realizes its prey is not where it expected. "Miss Prescott," he said, "you have traveled a considerable distance." "So have you," she said. "This is private property, Mr. Creel. I suspect Mr. Weston would be interested in knowing the nature of your business before he decides whether you are welcome here." Creel's eyes moved to Wallace, taking his measure the way men like him always did, looking for the soft spots. "I have business regarding some documents that belong to Mr. Dodd's company," Creel said. "Documents that appear to have gone missing from the Abilene office." "Then you should speak to the state investigator who arrived in Harlan Flats yesterday," Wallace said, and the satisfaction of saying that, the particular timing of it, was something Maude would remember for the rest of her life. Creel went still. He had not known about the investigator. The news worked through him visibly. "I would recommend," Wallace continued, in a voice that was perfectly level and perfectly cold, "that you ride back to town and speak to the state man before you say anything further to anyone on this ranch. Because anything you say to us is something we will repeat to him in detail, and I suspect you would prefer to choose your words carefully in these particular circumstances." The pause that followed was the kind that precedes a decision, and Maude watched it go through Creel: the calculation, the assessment of available moves, the arithmetic of risk. He turned his horse without a word and rode back down the drive, the unnamed second man trailing after him, and they did not look back. When they had gone far enough that the dust cloud from their horses was just a smear on the horizon, Maude let out a long, controlled breath. Wallace put his hand on her shoulder, and she leaned back into it without thinking about it, and he left his hand there for a moment before dropping it. "You are good in a tight place," he said. "I have had practice," she said. The state investigator's name was Aldrich Vance, a methodical and unimpressed man from the Austin Land Office, who had the look of someone who had seen every variety of land fraud that Texas had to offer, and was not excited to find another one. He came to the ranch on his second day in the county, accepted coffee, listened to everything Maude and Wallace and Whitmore had to say, reviewed the documents with a concentration that was professional and absolute, and at the end of 2 hours sat back in his chair and said, with the careful neutrality of a government man, that he believed sufficient evidence existed to initiate formal proceedings. He would not promise outcomes. He would not speculate on timelines. He was, in the nicest possible way, a wall of procedural caution. But he took the documents, all of them, the ledger copies and Whitmore's notes and the forged letter, and a detailed accounting that Maude had prepared laying out the falsification methodology step by step, and he put them in his official satchel with a lock on it, and he left on the stage to Austin 2 days later. Creel left Harlan Flats the morning after the investigator arrived. He did not wait for the stage. He took his unnamed companion and they rode out before dawn, and the consensus in town was that Dodd would know within a week that his plan in Cedar Creek County had collapsed, and that the formal trouble was coming from the direction of Austin. It would not be fast. The legal process would take months, possibly more. But the immediate threat to Maude's safety receded with Creel's departure, and the weight that had been sitting across her shoulders since that midnight in the Abilene office lightened enough that she could breathe fully for the first time in weeks. The creek kept rising, not fast and not to what it had been before the obstructions, but consistently, steadily, the way honest things grow. By the 3rd week of September, it was running at a foot deep in the main bed, and the cottonwood trees along its banks had gone from gray and exhausted to something approaching green at their tips, and the cattle had found it on their own and come to drink without needing to be moved. The drought was not over. The rains that would truly end it were still months away, but the land had water moving through it again, and that changed everything, the way water always changes everything it passes through. Whitmore threw a small gathering at his property to celebrate what he called the recovery of the creek, which was also, everyone understood, a celebration of the fact that Dodd's man had ridden away, and the state was involved, and the water rights of every ranch in the valley were a little safer than they had been a month ago. He invited Inez Vasquez and her granddaughter, and the local schoolteacher, Mr. Pemberton, who had the best fiddle in the county, and a handful of other neighbors whose names Maude had been learning in the weeks since her arrival. Cora Whitmore made 3 pies and a cake and looked pleased about the whole thing, and she spent a significant amount of the early evening standing near Maude and finding ways to steer Wallace in their direction, which she was not subtle about and which Maude found both endearing and amusing. After supper, when the tables had been cleared back and Pemberton's fiddle had warmed up and people had paired off for the dancing, Wallace appeared at Maude's elbow. "I do not dance well," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "I was taught by my father, who also did not dance well. We would be a disaster together then." "Probably," she agreed. "Would you like to try anyway?" He held out his hand and she took it, and they were indeed a disaster in the technical sense, stepping on each other's timing, laughing at themselves, working it out gradually, the way 2 people work anything out when they are paying attention and not too proud to adjust. By the second dance they were doing better, and by the third she was laughing at something he had said about his complete inability to locate a 2-step beat, and his face was alive in a way she had not seen it before, open and warm and very close to hers. Outside later, when the music was still going inside but they had drifted to the edge of the yard where the night was cool and the stars were violent overhead, she stood beside him and felt the warmth of his arm where it pressed against hers and did not move away. "I want to ask you something," she said. "You asked me something before," he said, "and it changed everything." "This one might also," she said, and felt her heart running a little fast. "I want to stay here permanently, not as a bookkeeper. Not as a woman in the spare bedroom. I want to know if that is something you want too, because if it is not, I would rather know now and go away cleanly than live in a situation where I am wanting more than is on offer." He was quiet for a moment, and she waited, because she had learned that his silences were not evasions but the spaces where he gathered his whole self into what he was about to say. "I am 41 years old," he said. "I have been a widower for 4 years. I have been lonely in the way that people do not talk about being lonely, not the dramatic kind, but the kind that is just the presence of empty space where someone used to be. And then you arrived in the worst kind of circumstances, unexpected and uninvited, and in 2 weeks you have done more for this ranch and this county, and for me personally than I have any right to account for." He turned to face her, and in the starlight his expression was everything she had been learning to read and translating now without difficulty. "I do not want you to go away cleanly," he said. "I want to court you properly. I want to give you the time that an honest beginning deserves. And at the end of that time, if you are still willing, I would like to ask you to marry me." The world was large and dark and full of stars and the sound of fiddle music, and Maude Prescott stood in it and felt, for the first time since her father died, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Yes to all of it," she said. "Start with the courting and we will get to the rest." He smiled, and it was the first real smile she had seen on him, not the controlled professional acknowledgement that passed for pleasantness but a real one, and it transformed his face into something that made her chest ache with the specific tenderness of a new feeling that has been allowed room to exist. He offered his arm and she took it and they went back inside for one more dance, and this time they found the beat on the first measure and kept it through the whole song. The autumn came in slowly, the way it does in that part of Texas, not so much a change of temperature as a slight relaxation of the heat, the afternoons cooling a few degrees, the mornings developing a crispness that the summer had entirely lacked. The creek held its new level, and even deepened a little when October brought 2 weeks of overcast sky and several nights of slow rain, not enough to declare the drought broken, but enough to give every living thing in the county a reason to believe the worst was behind them. Maude and Wallace's courtship was, by the standards of the place and time, careful and somewhat formal, which suited them both because they were careful people by nature. There were evenings on the porch, long and quiet and full of conversation that ranged from the practical to the philosophical and back. There were Sunday rides when the work was light enough to allow it, along the creek and up into the Cedar Hills where the autumn light came through the trees at a low angle and turned everything golden. There were shared meals that gradually became less about the food and more about the ritual of shared space, the easy closeness of two people learning each other's habits and finding them good. He brought her a book from the general store in Harlan Flats one afternoon, a novel she had mentioned wanting to read, and the care he had taken to remember it, and to go out of his way to get it, was so disproportionate to the object itself that she had to turn away briefly to collect herself before thanking him. She made him a proper set of account books for the ranch. Bound in leather, she traded 2 jars of her pickled vegetables for at the Whitmore place, and when she gave them to him, he turned them over in his hands with the reverence of a man who understood he was being given something that represented not just work but attention, and he said, quietly and carefully, that they were the finest thing he owned. He told her things. Gradually, over weeks, the way a door opens when it has been closed for a long time, not all at once but in stages. He told her about coming to Texas from Missouri at 22 with $40 and a mule and no particular plan, except to find land that could be made to mean something. He told her about the years before Clara, the hardship years that he did not make dramatic but that she could hear underneath the level telling of them, the droughts before this drought and the losses before this loss, and the particular stubbornness that had kept him going through all of it, the stubbornness that was, she thought, the best and most essential thing about him. He told her about his brother James, who had come west with him and died of a riding accident 3 years later, and about how the grief of that had settled differently than Clara's grief, less devastating but somehow more permanently embedded, the grief of losing the person who had known you longest. She told him things, too, about her father and the schoolroom that smelled of chalk and wood smoke, about the years of making her own way through a world that did not make it easy for a woman to do so, about the specific loneliness of being competent in situations that required you to remain invisible, about the fear during those last days in Abilene and the cold clarity of Creel's threat, and the decision to run that she did not regret making even as it had cost her everything she had built. "You were brave," he said one evening, after she had told him about the midnight discovery and the 24 hours that followed. "I was terrified," she said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said. She thought about that for a long time afterward. In November, word came from Austin that formal charges had been filed against Clarence Dodd and 2 associates, including Harlan Creel, for fraudulent misrepresentation of trust records and attempted unlawful seizure of water rights in Cedar Creek County. The state land office had frozen all trust proceedings pending the investigation. The county judge, whose relationship with Dodd had apparently been even more compromised than anyone had realized, had quietly resigned his position and left the county. Whitmore rode over with the news on a Thursday afternoon, waving the letter from Aldrich Vance's office like a man who had won an argument he had been having for 3 years, which in effect he had. Inez Vasquez came the following morning with more of her preserved peppers and a bottle of something she described only as a family recipe, and they all sat around Wallace's kitchen table and raised tin cups to the creek and the spring and the documents and each other. Maude accepted her cup and looked around the table at these people who had been strangers 2 months ago and were now the entire fabric of her world in Cedar Creek County, and felt something that she could only describe as fullness, the specific fullness of a life that has been empty for a long time finally being filled by the right things. Wallace caught her eye across the table, and in that brief exchange she saw everything she needed to see. He proposed properly on a Saturday in December, on the bank of the creek, which was running clear and cold in the winter light. He had prepared for it in the way he prepared for everything important, deliberately and privately, and what he said was simple and complete. That he loved her, that he had fallen in love with her sometime between the ledger and the creek, and had been waiting to be sure enough of her answer to say so, and that he was asking her to marry him not because the practical circumstances of their shared situation demanded it, but because the thought of her not being here was something he could not regard without a feeling of profound loss. She said yes before he had fully finished asking. And then she apologized for interrupting him, and he said he did not mind at all. They married in February of 1883 in the Harlan Flats Church, on a clear cold morning when the creek was running at its highest level in 4 years, fed by winter rains that had come in January in a sustained way that old Inez said meant the drought was truly breaking. The preacher was the circuit man, who had arrived 2 days early when Whitmore rode to meet his regular route, and told him there was a wedding that needed doing. Cora Whitmore and Inez Vasquez stood on Maude's side, and Carl Dupree and Roberto stood on Wallace's, and the small church was full of neighbors and townspeople who had come partly out of genuine warmth for the Weston ranch and partly, Maude suspected, out of the very human interest in seeing what the woman who had come with the drought's ending looked like in a wedding dress. She wore her best dress, which was blue wool and fit her well, and was not technically a wedding dress but served. She had sewn a new collar on it from a length of ivory lace that Cora had contributed with great emotion, and the effect was good enough that, when she came through the church door on Whitmore's arm, who had offered himself for the occasion with the courtly seriousness of a man doing something that mattered, she heard the small collective intake of breath that is the best response an entrance can receive. Wallace was waiting at the altar with the kind of stillness that was not nervousness but concentrated presence, and when he turned to watch her come down the aisle his expression was so completely open that she felt tears for the first time since she had arrived in Cedar Creek County, which said something about how thoroughly she had been braced and careful through all the hard things and how thoroughly she could let herself stop being braced now. She did not cry at the altar. She made it. But her voice shook slightly on the words, "I will," and his voice shook slightly on the same words, and the preacher smiled the way preachers do when they know the moment is real. They had a small gathering at the ranch afterward, with a supper that Cora and Mrs. Elkins from the general store had organized between them, and Pemberton played his fiddle again, and this time Wallace and Maude danced without any discussion of whether they were good at it, because it did not matter at all. The winter moved into spring. The rains came twice more before March was done, and by April the creek was running at a level that Wallace said he had not seen since the year he arrived at the property, deep enough that the cattle could stand in the shallows, and the cottonwoods along the bank had leafed out in a green that was almost extravagant after years of gray. Roberto planted a vegetable garden on the south side of the house, something he had apparently been wanting to do for 2 years but had not attempted during the drought, and Maude worked alongside him on the days when the ranch accounts were done, and the household was managed, learning from him the specific knowledge of soil and seed timing that she had not known before, and that seemed to her like a good thing to spend a life learning. Wallace watched her do this, the way he watched everything she did, with the steady attention of a man who is not tired of looking at something. Spring in Cedar Creek County turned out to be a remarkable thing after years of dry. The grass came back in long sweeping waves of green that moved in the wind and made the whole valley look like it was breathing. Wildflowers appeared in the pastures, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and things Maude could not name, but that Inez Vasquez identified with the fluency of someone who had been reading this landscape her whole long life. The cattle put on weight. The well recovered. The ranch's accounts, which Maude managed with her natural precision, and which Wallace had entirely turned over to her, moved from the red column to the black by the end of May, and she showed him the numbers on a Tuesday evening, and he looked at them for a long time and then looked at her. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she said. He pulled her against him, which he had learned to do easily and which she had learned to receive without the old wariness of someone who has not been held in a long time, and they stood together in the kitchen with the account book open on the table and the evening coming golden through the windows. In June, Maude told him she was carrying their child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, with the same directness she brought to everything, and she watched it move through him like a wave, the surprise and then the joy and then something deeper underneath the joy, something that had the texture of wholeness, of a man who has lost a great deal and who is being given back something he had stopped expecting. He put his head down for a moment, and she put her hand over his where it rested on the table, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the creek ran outside and the summer morning came bright and warm through the kitchen window. "A boy," he said finally. "We do not know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I have a feeling." He was right. Their son arrived in February of 1884, a winter baby, loud and healthy and red-faced with the indignation of existence, and they named him James Wallace Weston, after the brother who had known Wallace longest and loved him best. Carl Dupree stood in the yard outside the bedroom window the entire night of the birth and refused to go to the bunkhouse, and Roberto could not stop smiling for 3 days. Inez Vasquez came the morning after, as she had come for every significant event, with food and a calm practicality that was exactly what the situation required, and she looked at the baby with her dark eyes full of something ancient and unsentimental and good, and she said in Spanish, something that Maude asked Roberto to translate later. He told her it meant roughly, "He will grow up knowing where the water comes from." Maude thought that was exactly right. The formal judgment in the Dodd case came that same spring, a letter from Aldrich Vance's office informing them that Clarence Dodd had been found liable for fraudulent misrepresentation of trust records and ordered to relinquish all claims on Cedar Creek County water rights, that the trust had been formally reconstituted under legitimate county administration, and that all affected property owners would receive documentation confirming their rights restored in full. Harlan Creel had been separately charged and had apparently accepted a reduced consequence in exchange for testimony against Dodd. Wallace read the letter aloud at the kitchen table, the baby in Maude's arms, and when he finished there was a silence that was not empty but full, the particular fullness of something that has been fought for and won. "Send a copy to Whitmore," Maude said. "And one to Inez," Wallace said. "And one to Aldrich Vance," she added, with a letter of thanks. "He did his job honestly. That is worth acknowledging." "I will write it tonight," he said. "We will write it together," she said. James grew the way children grow on healthy land, fast and constantly surprising. He was walking before he was a year, talking in complete and opinionated sentences before he was 2, and attached to the horses in the same instinctive way that Wallace had always been attached to them, which resulted in a number of near misses at the corral fence that required the installation of a second board at the bottom. Whitmore came to dinner on a Sunday and spent half the meal watching James eat and the other half watching Wallace and Maude talk to each other. The easy, unperforming talk of two people who have genuinely become the world to each other. And at the end of the evening he said to Maude on the porch, very quietly, "I never thought he would look like that again." "Like what?" she asked. "Like he is where he belongs," Whitmore said. She looked through the window at Wallace inside, telling James something about horses that the child was absorbing with absolute seriousness, and she felt the full weight of the man's observation and what it meant to him to see it and what it meant to her to have been the cause of it. "I am where I belong too," she said, "for what it is worth." Whitmore squeezed her shoulder and went to get his horse, and she stood on the porch in the early dark and listened to the creek running beyond the fence line, and the sound of her husband's voice inside and the giggle of her son. And the night was warm and soft and smelled of the first cut hay in the far pasture, and the stars were as violent and extravagant as they had been every night since she arrived, and she was not lonely, had not been lonely for a long time. And the difference between the life she had lived before this and the life she was living now was so complete that it seemed to belong to two different stories. But it was one story. It was hers. It had always been moving toward this, through the hard and terrifying parts and through the choosing and the building, through the dried-out creek and the hidden spring and the forged letter and the long road from Abilene, toward this porch and this ranch and this man and this life. She went inside. In the summer of 1885, the rains came generous and steady for 6 full weeks, the kind of soaking rains that had not visited Cedar Creek County in nearly a decade. And when they stopped, the land was transformed in a way that even those who had believed in the recovery were not entirely prepared for. Palo Duro Creek ran at a level that required a proper plank bridge to cross the main ford, and Wallace had it built in a week with Carl and Roberto and 2 men hired from town. And on the day it was finished, he and Maude stood on it together and looked at the water moving below them and held hands the way they had learned to hold hands, comfortably and without theater. Roberto had been made foreman the previous spring, with a proper salary and a share arrangement in the cattle operation, which he accepted with the quiet dignity of a man who is used to having to prove himself and has proven himself completely. He had also, in the winter, begun visiting a young woman named Alejandra Ortega, whose family had a small farm south of Inez Vasquez's property, and the courtship had that steady, serious quality that made it clear to anyone watching that it was going to result in a wedding, which it did in September of 1885, a small celebration at the Ortega farm where Maude and Wallace danced together with the easy proficiency of 2 people who have had enough practice at it to stop thinking about their feet. James, who was 1.5 years old at the wedding, spent most of the celebration being passed between Inez and Cora Whitmore and Roberto's mother and Maude's arms, and greeted everyone with the cheerful imperialism of a child who has been reliably loved from the beginning and therefore expects the world to be good. Maude found herself pregnant again in the winter of 1885. She told Wallace in the same kitchen, at the same table, with the same directness, and his response was the same wave of emotion, no less for being the second time but perhaps deeper for it, the particular deepening of a joy that is becoming a life's pattern rather than a single extraordinary event. "Another boy?" he asked. "We do not know that," she said. "No," he agreed. Their daughter arrived in August of 1886, during a warm spell that everyone agreed was mild by comparison with the years before the drought broke. She was dark-haired and serious-eyed, and after some discussion they named her Clara Inez Weston, the first name for the woman who had loved this place before Maude came to it, and the second for the woman who had known where the water came from. It seemed to Maude the most honest tribute she could offer in both directions, and when she told Inez Vasquez the second name, the old woman sat very still for a moment and then said, in a voice that was entirely steady, that she was honored. Clara grew into her name, which was complicated and serious and full of history, and she was from the first months a different kind of child than James, quieter and more observing, with a habit of watching things carefully before committing to them that Maude recognized as her own earliest way of being in the world, and that she found in her daughter both touching and familiar. James took it upon himself to introduce his sister to the horses as soon as she could walk with confidence, which was at 14 months, and the gravity with which he performed this introduction, one small boy solemnly presenting a smaller girl to a large brown horse, was something that Wallace described to Whitmore later with a smile that did not leave his face for the rest of the day. The ranch prospered. Honestly prospered, not in the exaggerated way of land speculation or the hollow way of credit leverage, but in the steady accumulative way of good management and consistent work, and a piece of ground that had been treated with respect and was returning that respect through its own productivity. The cattle herd grew. The account stayed in the black. The house gained a second proper bedroom when James outgrew the cot in the corner of the first, and Maude managed the construction budget with her usual precision, and Wallace built the frame with Roberto and Carl and 2 of the neighbor boys. And when it was done, it was solid and right and added to the house without disrupting it, the way all the best additions do. Carl Dupree retired in the spring of 1887, at whatever age he actually was, which he had never disclosed and which Roberto estimated as somewhere between 60 and forever. He did not leave the valley. He took a small house in Harlan Flats and remained the most reliable source of practical advice for the Weston Ranch, and for anyone else in the county who knew enough to ask him. Wallace paid him a small continuing wage for consultation that was never officially necessary and always actually useful, and Carl accepted it with the grace of a man who knows when he is being loved through practicality. The legal aftermath of the Dodd case settled slowly into history. The Water Trust was reestablished under a properly administered county board, of which Wallace became a member in 1887, a role that required one afternoon a month in Harlan Flats for meetings, and that he performed with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, reading every document thoroughly, and saying less than most of the other board members but meaning more when he did speak. Maude sometimes reviewed the trust documents before the meetings, quietly and without being asked, and occasionally she placed a piece of paper beside his breakfast plate with a number or a notation that she thought was worth raising, and he always raised it, and it was always worth raising. They did not talk often about the early weeks of her arrival, the forged letter and Creel's visit, and the hard urgency of the whole beginning. It had the quality of a storm that has passed, present in the memory but not requiring constant reference. What it had produced was here: the creek running, the land green, the house full. On an evening in the spring of 1888, 6 years after Maude had stepped down from a buckboard in the Weston yard and been told to leave, she sat on the porch with Wallace as the light went golden and long over the pastures, and James and Clara played in the yard below them, their small voices carrying in the warm air, and the creek was audible beyond the fence, a constant sound that she had learned to hear as the foundation tone underneath everything. She rested her head against his shoulder, which she could do without thinking now, the way you do things without thinking that have become part of the structure of your days, and he put his arm around her, also without thinking, also as a thing that had become so natural that its absence would be the remarkable thing. "I think about that morning sometimes," she said, "when I drove in and you told me to leave." "I think about it too," he said. "You were so certain I was trouble," she said. "I was right," he said. "You were trouble," she laughed, "the best kind, the only kind worth having," he said. Below them, James had caught a firefly in his cupped hands and was showing Clara with intense seriousness, and Clara was looking at it with her characteristic careful attention, and the firefly pulsed green in the gathering dusk, and then James opened his hands and let it go, and they both watched it rise, and even from the porch the wonder on their faces was visible. Wallace watched his children for a moment and then looked at Maude, and she turned her head from the yard to find him looking at her with the same expression she had seen on the creek bank that first morning when the water was moving, open and complete and full of something that had no adequate name in any language, but that every person who has ever been given back what they thought they had lost for good will recognize. "You brought something," he said quietly. "You always say that," she said. "I always mean it," he said. She thought about the spring in the limestone hills and the cleared channel and the forged letter that had become the most improbable and exact invitation of her life. She thought about her father's watch, which had paid for a filing fee in Austin and helped preserve the water rights of a whole valley. She thought about Inez Vasquez's dark eyes and Roberto's quiet songs and Whitmore's warm laughter and Cora's ivory lace. She thought about all the things that had already been here, waiting in the hills and the dry creek bed and the hidden spring, needing only someone who knew how to look. "It was already here," she said. "I just found it." "That is the same thing," Wallace said. The evening settled over Weston Ranch, rich and warm and full of the sounds that had become the vocabulary of home, the children's voices dropping to murmurs as the fireflies multiplied in the dusk, the horses settling in the corral, the creek running in its restored channel through the dark, and the first stars arriving in the east one by one, the way everything good arrives, quietly and without announcement, until you look up and find the whole sky full of them. Maude looked up at the stars, and she was full, and she was home, and there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left to find. She had found it all. She was staying.